fame that continued to grow after his death, with posterity finally placing him on a pedestal as the greatest Urdu poet of all time. Many reasons can be proposed for this. The changed literary culture, not the least important among them. Ghalib's reputation as Urdu's greatest poet, and not just one of the greatest, was further elevated by Abdur Rahman Bijnori, a young scholar well versed in the European literary tradition and with the knowledge of many European languages. He presented Ghalib as a poet of superior intellectual powers whose peers and equals could only be found in, say, Heinrich Heine, Arthur Rimbaud, and other European poets. Bijnori's stimulating book-length essay, Mahasine Kalame Ghalib, Merits of Ghalib's Poetry, published in 1921, begins with a resounding rhetorical claim, which in one bold stroke puts Ghalib on the same plane as the Vedas. He said, quote, India has just two scriptures or divine gospels, the Holy Vedas and the Divan-e-Ghalib, end quote. Bijnori's essay was added as the introduction to the rediscovered manuscript of Ghalib's early poetry when it was published in 1921. This manuscript is dated 1821 and contains mostly Urdu poetry. The manuscript Divan recorded numerous Urdu verses that Ghalib didn't include in his published, authorized edition. In fact, his authorized Divan went through 5 editions in his lifetime. The manuscript Divan of 1821 showed that Ghalib had composed nearly twice as many verses than what he published as Divan-e-Ghalib in 1841. The recovery or rediscovery of the so-called rejected verses, Mustarad Kalam, in 1917 became a landmark in Ghalib studies. For one thing, it kindled some interest in the rejected verses that had not received searching scholarly attention so far. Even so, the so-called rejected verses didn't find full-length studies and interpretive commentaries for many years. One commentary, dated 1934, wasn't published until much later. Another one from around the same year, 1931, became so rare that not many people are even aware of it. Many summers ago, I began to study, translate, and annotate Ghalib's rejected verses in an attempt to understand the poems in depth and also to investigate why Ghalib had omitted them when he made the selections for his Urdu Divan. I noticed that often entire ghazals were left out. Sometimes only certain verses were taken out. Occasionally new verses were added. What was left in and left out helped me understand the process of selection somewhat, and also Ghalib's own poetics or poetic perceptions. Clearly, there was much about the selection that needed analysis. The general opinion of scholars has been that Ghalib rejected verses that were too complex and mostly belonged to the early phase of his career. His early poetry was perceived to be loaded with far-fetched, abstract, and sometimes meaningless metaphors, or too full of wordiness, or simply imperfect, especially when compared to his later compositions. Therefore, it was assumed that most of the excisions have been from the early period, which abounded in difficult verses and high-sounding Persianate constructions that didn't repay the mental labor needed to decipher them. To be sure, some Percipient scholars, Malik Ram being the foremost among them, did say that some of Ghalib's best and most illustrious verses dated from precisely that early period. But a systematic study of all the issues involved was not attempted. I found that Ghalib composed both difficult and deceptively easy verses throughout his poetic career. That is not to say that he made a somewhat unwilling transition to simple poetry from his early difficult poetry. Ghalib's poetic trajectory begins from Urdu, moves to composing almost entirely in Persian, and then swings back to Urdu. It is nearly as intricate as his poetry.